Have you noticed a shift in your neighborhood recently? Like you're driving down a familiar street, looking at a new subdivision going up, and instead of a traditional for sale sign with a, smiling realtor's face on it, there's just a corporate leasing office.
Yeah, or you've watched a house down the block go on the market, but instead of a new family moving in with a mortgage and a U-Haul, it just gets a fresh coat of paint and a for rent sign.
Right. It's the new American reality. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping straight into the dual extremes of the modern housing market.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. We're going to figure out why renting an entire house is suddenly becoming this premium lifestyle choice for the middle class, while at the exact same time, a catastrophic housing shortage is unfolding for America's lowest earners.
Yeah, the contrast is stark. And to guide us, we're looking at a stack of incredibly insightful sources today.
We've got a commercial real estate brief from CRE Daily, a heavy-hitting financial market update on single-family rentals from Houlihan Lokey. That one is from August 2025.
And we also have a comprehensive, deeply sobering report from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, or NLIHC, on the affordable housing gap.
Right. And the landscape of American housing is just undergoing a massive transformation. It's pulling in two completely opposite directions.
Exactly. And to understand the crisis at the bottom, we actually have to start by looking at the macro shift happening in the middle class. We have to look at how, and crucially, why Americans are fundamentally changing the way they choose to live.
The data from CRE Daily really highlights the scale of that shift. I mean, the single-family rental boom, they call it SFR in the industry, it's not just some post-pandemic blip.
No, not at all.
In 2025, single-family rentals hit a 7-year high, reaching an astonishing 14.6 million homes.
Wow.
Yeah, 14.6 million. That is a massive footprint of houses that are no longer occupied by owners.
It is. And to understand the motivation behind that footprint, we really have to look at the underlying math of homeownership, which, the Houlihan Lokey data shows is essentially broken right now.
Broken is a good word for it.
Yeah. I mean, since the year 2000, the median household income in the United States grew by 99%, which on paper, doubling your income over 2 decades sounds like solid economic progress.
Right. It sounds great until you realize everything else went up too.
Exactly. Far outpaced it, actually. Over that exact same period, median home prices skyrocketed by 156%.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so the fundamental relationship between what an average person earns and what an average house costs, it's just been severed entirely. The purchasing power just isn't there anymore.
Or basic economics kicks in at that point, The Houlihan Lokey report lays out the current monthly reality. The average monthly cost of home ownership for a median-priced home right now is $2,525.
Right.
But if you rent a single-family home, the average is $2,312.
That is a real difference.
Yes, that's over a $200 difference in your pocket every single month. And that's before you even factor in the hidden costs of ownership, like, replacing a roof or property taxes or fixing a broken water heater.
Exactly. And the demographic facing this broken math head-on is the largest segment of the population. Millennials, who are currently at 74 million people, they're squarely in their prime family-raising years right now.
They want the backyard.
They want the backyard, the extra bedroom, and right behind them is Gen Z, another 71 million people who are just starting to form independent households.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the narrative we've all been sold is that renting a house is just a temporary stepping stone. You rent a small place for a few years, save up your down payment, and eventually buy your own home.
Right, the traditional American dream.
Exactly. The path to home ownership used to be like an escalator. You step onto a starter home and you just let time carry your equity up. But now the escalator is broken and people are just choosing to lease luxury apartments on the ground floor rather than take the stairs. Renting has become the final destination.
What's fascinating here is the counterintuitive upside for this specific demographic. Because these millennials and Gen Z earners are opting out of the brutal, hyper-competitive home buying market, their rent-to-income ratio is actually improving.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it recently dropped to 28.1%.
Oh, wow. So that means they're spending a smaller percentage of their take-home pay on a rental house than they would be forced to spend on a mortgage for that exact same house.
Precisely. It gives them significant discretionary income. And think about the flexibility that provides. I mean, you can move across the country for a new job without the friction of selling property.
Yeah, you aren't tied down.
Right. And more importantly, it allows a young family to rent a house in a premium, highly rated school district immediately without needing to save up a massive six-figure down payment just to buy their way into that neighborhood.
That makes so much sense. It shifts from being a financial compromise to a deliberate lifestyle optimization. But if millions of people are making that deliberate choice to rent full houses, where's all this supply coming from? I mean, who is actually the landlord? Because if you scroll through news headlines, the overwhelming narrative is that Wall Street hedge funds are just swooping in and buying up every other house in America.
Media narrative is definitely fixated on institutional investors, for sure. But the Houlihan-Lokey report busts that myth completely.
Really?
Yeah, when you look at the hard data, institutional investors, meaning the big Wall Street firms and massive real estate investment trusts, they actually own less than 5% of all single-family rentals in the country.
Wait, so it's not just hedge funds buying up the neighborhood. It's actually Gary and Linda down the street holding onto their 3% mortgage.
That is exactly it. The market is overwhelmingly dominated by mom and pop landlords, and you are absolutely correct that they are hoarding the supply. The industry calls this the shadow inventory.
The shadow inventory, wow.
Yeah. We have to look at the mechanics of why they are holding onto these properties. Right now, 62% of mortgage holders in the U.S. have locked-in rates below 4%.
Oh, that's huge.
And furthermore, 33.5% of baby boomers say they will never sell their current homes.
Right, so we're talking about the golden handcuffs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Consider the financial logic for Gary and Linda. Why would they sell a house where they hold a 3% mortgage just to turn around and finance a smaller, downsized condo at a 7% mortgage?
They'd be paying more money every month for less space.
Exactly. The math incentivizes them to freeze. So instead of selling that starter home to a new millennial buyer, they hold on to it and lease it out to that exact same millennial who is now looking for a premium rental.
But the supply isn't just coming from existing homeowners refusing to sell, right? Developers are actively leaning into this trend too.
In a major way, yeah. We are seeing the rise of the build-to-rent, or BTR, movement. Developers realize that instead of buying scattered homes one by one or building subdivisions to sell to individual buyers, they could just build entire neighborhoods designed from the ground up to be permanent rentals.
That is wild.
We are talking about communities with shared amenities, professional property management, uniform maintenance. BTR construction now exceeds 7% of all single-family housing starts.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, the historical average was only 2.3%.
It's an entirely new class of real estate. You know, you get the white picket fence in the driveway, but you also get a property manager who fixes the sink.
This raises an important question. If homeowners are hoarding their properties and developers are pouring resources into rental neighborhoods, what does this do to the overall supply and demand balance of the country?
Right.
For the last decade, we suffered a massive underbuilding shortfall, estimated to be somewhere between 3.8 to 5.5 million homes. That severe lack of supply is the core engine that drove rents and home prices up so aggressively.
And now we have developers just rushing to fill that void.
Right. We are seeing a sudden spike in new deliveries from all this recent BTR and apartment construction. The mechanics of supply and demand are functioning. This flood of new units is temporarily cooling rent growth. Landlords have to compete for tenants again.
Which is good news for renters.
For now, yes. However, the data also shows that new building permits are starting to slow down. High construction costs and interest rates are making new projects harder to finance. So this current relief in rent prices might just be a temporary blip as the new supply gets absorbed by the market.
So the market is highly efficient at creating these $2,300 a month rentals for millennials. The developers see a demographic with disposable income, they see the broken math of homeownership, and they step in to provide a highly optimized product. But that efficiency relies entirely on a healthy profit margin. What happens when you apply that exact same free market logic to the 11 million Americans who can only afford a fraction of that rent? This brings us to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's GAP report.
Yeah, and the transition from the Houlihan-Lokey data to the NLIHC report, it feels like stepping onto a different planet.
It really does.
The GAP report focuses entirely on what they define as extremely low income, or ELI, renters. To understand this demographic, we need to clarify what area median income, or AMI, means.
Right.
AMI is simply the midpoint of a specific region's income distribution. It accounts for local economic realities, like the median income in Manhattan is vastly different from the median income in rural Idaho.
Obviously, yeah.
So an ELI household is defined as one whose income sits at or below the federal poverty deadline, or 30% of their specific area median income. Nationwide, there are 11 million of these ELI renter households.
11 million. Let's walk through the math of their reality, because the numbers here are just staggering. Nationally, out of the entire American housing stock, there are only 7.2 million homes that are technically affordable to those 11 million ELI households.
So we begin with an immediate deficit. But the mechanics of the broader housing crisis make it significantly worse. Of those 7.2 million theoretically affordable homes, 3.4 million of them are currently occupied by higher income earners.
Because the middle class is feeling the squeeze too. I mean, if a middle income earner is priced out of buying a home, and maybe even priced out of a premium build-to-rent community, they rent down. They take a cheaper apartment to save money.
Right, and that downward pressure means that out of the original 7.2 million affordable homes, only 3.8 million are actually available.
Leaving 3.8 million affordable and available homes for 11 million extremely low-income households.
Yeah.
That creates a massive systemic shortage of 7.2 million homes. If you break it down to a ratio, there are only 35 affordable and available homes for every 100 ELI renters in the country.
It's devastating.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Well, honestly, it's more heartbreaking than interesting. The housing market is essentially a brutal game of musical chairs. But the game is rigged. The higher income earners get to walk into the room and sit down in the cheap seats before the music even stops.
Yeah.
And they do it out of their own financial necessity, but by occupying those affordable seats, they leave the lowest income earners standing in the middle of the room with literally nowhere to go.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look closely at who is actually left standing when that music stops. Who makes up these 11 million extremely low-income renter households?
Right.
It is incredibly easy for society to rely on stereotypes here, but the demographic data paints a deeply human and complex picture. 33% of these householders are seniors.
Wow.
18% have disabilities, and 34% are currently in the labor force, often working 40 or more hours a week in low-wage jobs.
So we're talking about aging parents on fixed incomes, individuals managing severe physical or cognitive health issues, and the essential workers keeping the local economy running. You know, the people working retail registers, cleaning office buildings, and staffing distribution centers.
Precisely. And because there are only 35 affordable units for every 100 of these households, they are forced to rent places on the private market that they mathematically cannot afford. Consequently, 74% of ELI renters are classified as severely cost-burdened.
And just to put a definition on that term, being severely cost-burdened means a household is spending more than half of its entire gross income strictly on rent and basic utilities.
Spending over 50% of your income on housing means the margin for error in your life is zero.
Zero.
Every single month becomes a crisis management exercise. It is a constant recurring choice between paying the rent to avoid eviction, or buying groceries, or refilling an essential prescription.
Yeah, one broken down car or one medical emergency just spirals into housing instability.
Mm-hmm.
But if the need is this massive, 7.2 million homes, why doesn't the free market just step in and fix it? We just spent the first half of this deep dive discussing how incredibly efficient developers are at building entire neighborhoods from scratch for millennials.
Right.
Why can't a private developer simply purchase land and build basic, safe, affordable apartment complexes for this lowest income bracket?
The simplest answer is that the underlying mechanics of construction and finance just make it impossible. The math simply doesn't work.
How so?
Think about what it takes to build an apartment building. A developer has to purchase the land, navigate complex local zoning laws, buy raw materials like lumber and steel, pay for skilled labor.
Right.
Then, once the building is finished, they have to pay recurring property taxes, insurance, routine maintenance. The maximum rent that an extremely low-income household can afford to pay is so low that it physically cannot cover those baseline costs.
Oh, I see.
In many cases, the affordable rent wouldn't even cover the ongoing monthly property tax and maintenance, let alone generate enough revenue to pay back the initial construction loan. Without significant public subsidies, a private developer would lose millions of dollars on day one.
Yeah, the private market is fundamentally designed to seek a return on investment. If a project guarantees a loss, The shovels never hit the dirt.
Exactly. And we have to acknowledge who bears the heaviest burden of this mathematical failure. The NLIHC report highlights severe demographic disparities that reflect decades of systemic inequality.
Right.
18% of Black households, 16% of American Indian or Alaska Native households, and 13% of Latino households are extremely low-income renters. You compare that to just 6% of white households.
It's a structural disparity.
Yeah.
And reading through the geographic data in the report, this is clearly not just an issue confined to expensive coastal cities like San Francisco or New York. It's not just a localized problem where land is scarce.
No, it is entirely ubiquitous. There is no state and no major metropolitan area in the entire United States that has an adequate supply of affordable housing for these renters.
None of them.
The shortage exists everywhere. Interestingly, the worst state in the nation for affordable housing availability is actually Nevada, where there are only 16 available homes for every 100 ELI renters.
Only 16. That is bleak. So what does this all mean? We have an 11 million household demand. We know that private developers and institutional investors mathematically cannot fix this shortage because the costs exceed the potential revenue. If the free market is structurally incapable of solving this, who can? We can't function as a society with 11 million households continually teetering on the brink of homelessness.
Well, the NLIHC report concludes that because the private market cannot serve this demographic without taking a financial loss, the only viable solution requires federal intervention.
Okay.
Operating as an objective analysis of the data, the report proposes several specific mechanical policy shifts. First, they call for increased, deeply targeted rental subsidies.
How do those actually function in practice?
Essentially, a deeply targeted subsidy bridges the gap between the actual cost of operating a housing unit and the amount the ELI renter can afford to pay.
Right.
If a unit costs $1,200 a month just to maintain and pay taxes on, but the renter can only afford $400, the federal subsidy covers that $800 difference.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah, it makes the math work for the building owner while keeping the tenant housed. Beyond subsidies, the report emphasizes the urgent need to preserve the existing affordable housing stock.
Because we're losing it.
We are losing older, affordable apartment buildings every single day to developers who buy them, tear them down, and replace them with luxury units. Finally, they advocate for robust emergency eviction assistance programs.
To catch people before they fall.
Exactly. The goal is to provide a temporary financial safety net so that a household facing a short-term crisis, like a sudden medical bill, doesn't lose their housing and enter the far more expensive shelter system.
So they're basically treating housing for this demographic, not as a private market commodity, but as essential public infrastructure.
Yes. It requires viewing affordable housing through the same lens we use for public roads or public schools as a systemic necessity required for a functioning society.
Wow. We have traversed a remarkably complex landscape today. I mean, we started out looking at this shiny new, highly optimized reality, gleaming built-to-rent communities with dog parks and smart home technology, driven by Gen Z and millennials who are seeking flexibility and actively choosing to bypass the traditional overpriced mortgage trap.
Right.
We look at the mom-and-pop landlords holding onto their Galween handcuffs, leasing out their 3% mortgage homes because the financial incentives tell them to hoard that asset.
And that is a portrait of a market functioning exactly as it is designed to for the middle class, adapting efficiently to new economic realities and providing a product that people actually want.
But then we turned the coin over and looked at the shadow side of that exact same economy, a systemic 7.2 million home shortage for America's most vulnerable citizens.
Yeah.
Working class families, elderly individuals on fixed incomes, and people with disabilities who are just pushed out of the musical chairs game entirely. People who are spending over half their income just to keep a roof over their heads because the free market simply cannot build for them without taking a loss.
It truly is a tale of two entirely different housing markets existing simultaneously on the exact same streets.
It really is. And here is why all of this matters to you listening right now. Whether you are currently enjoying the flexibility of renting a house in one of those new BTR communities, or you're sitting comfortably on a 3% mortgage that you will never let go of, or you are simply heading to the polls to vote on local zoning laws, this dual housing market impacts the economy, the school systems, and the social fabric of your immediate community.
Absolutely.
You cannot separate the barista who can no longer afford rent from the survival of that coffee shop you love in your neighborhood. The mechanics of this market touch everyone.
The health and stability of a community inherently require accessible housing at all income levels. When one end of the spectrum breaks down, the friction is felt throughout the entire local economy.
We want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. Think back to that neighborhood we talked about at the very beginning, the one where the for sale signs have been replaced by the corporate leasing office. If the traditional American dream of homeownership is permanently being replaced by this new American reality of permanent renting for the middle class, how does society redefine neighborhood stability and generational wealth building moving forward?
That's a huge question.
If we aren't passing down property, what are we passing down? And more importantly, as we construct this highly efficient new reality, how do we ensure the most vulnerable aren't completely erased from the map in the process?